The most dangerous questions are never loud. They are quiet, polite, and asked by people who already think they know the answer. The morning rush at Riverside Diner always felt like controlled chaos. Plates clattered behind the counter, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with sizzling bacon, and the soft hum of conversation filled every corner of the small restaurant. It was the kind of place where regulars knew each other's names, where servers memorized orders before they were spoken, and where life moved fast enough that most people did not stop to think too deeply about anything. I wiped down table number 7 for the third time that morning, even though it was already clean. It was a habit, something to keep my hands busy while my mind stayed focused. My name is Olivia Bennett, and at 28 years old, I had learned how to exist in spaces where I was often overlooked. I was not invisible, but I had mastered the art of not taking up more space than I needed. "Olivia, table 3 needs water," my manager called from behind the counter. "Already on it," I replied, grabbing a fresh pitcher. The bell above the diner door rang softly, a sound that usually meant nothing more than another hungry customer stepping inside from the cold Chicago morning. But that morning was different. The room did not change loudly. It changed quietly. Conversations did not stop, but they slowed for half a second, like the air itself had paused to notice something. I looked up as I approached table 3, and that was when I saw him. He did not match the diner. That was the first thought that crossed my mind. Not because he looked out of place in an obvious way, but because everything about him belonged somewhere else. He wore a dark tailored coat that did not belong to a place with plastic salt shakers and worn vinyl booths. His posture was calm, controlled, the kind of stillness that suggested he never had to rush for anything in his life. He sat alone, looking out the window as if he was observing something beyond the street, beyond the city itself. I placed the water glass on the table carefully. "Good morning. What can I get started for you?" He did not look at the menu. He looked at me. Not in a way that was rude, but in a way that felt deliberate, like I was part of a decision he was already making in his mind. "Coffee," he said. His voice was calm, precise, without hesitation. "Black." I nodded. "Anything else?" "Not yet." I turned to leave, but something about the silence made me pause. It was not empty silence. It was weighted silence. The kind that makes you feel like you are being measured without being touched. When I returned with his coffee, I noticed he had not moved. He was still watching the room, observing the staff, the customers, the rhythm of the diner like it was data instead of life. I set the cup down. "Refill anytime," I said. "Thank you," he replied without breaking focus. I should have walked away immediately. That is what I usually did. But instead I found myself noticing the small details. The expensive watch beneath his sleeve. The clean lines of his coat. The fact that 2 men sitting at the far corner of the diner had not taken their eyes off him since he entered. They were not customers. That much was clear even without being told. My stomach tightened slightly, though I told myself it was nothing. People like that did not belong in my world. And I did not belong in theirs. I turned to leave again, but his voice stopped me. Not loud. Not demanding. Just enough to make me pause. "Olivia Bennett." I froze for half a second. I had not told him my name. Slowly I turned back. He was still seated, still calm, still unreadable. "Yes," I said carefully. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands near the coffee cup but not touching it. "I have a question for you." Something in his tone made the air feel heavier. Not threatening. Not aggressive. Just controlled. Measured. The kind of control that comes from a person who is used to deciding outcomes before they happen. "Go ahead," I said. I had no idea that a single question, asked in a quiet diner on an ordinary morning, would be the moment everything started to change. The question hung in the air longer than it should have. Not because it was complicated, but because of the way he asked it. Calm. Controlled. Like he already knew how I would respond and was simply waiting for confirmation. Around us, the diner continued its usual rhythm. A fork clinked against a ceramic plate. Someone laughed near the window booth. The coffee machine hissed softly behind the counter. But at table 7, time felt slightly slowed. I stood there holding my notepad, suddenly aware that I was no longer just serving a customer. I was part of something I did not understand yet. "What is your question?" I asked carefully. He did not answer immediately. Instead, He looked at me the way someone might look at a document they were about to sign, as if the next words mattered more than the setting around them. Then he spoke. Why should I trust someone like you with anything important? The question was simple, almost polite, but it landed heavily in my chest. For a second I almost laughed because it felt absurd. Important. Trust. Those were not words people usually connected to me. I was a waitress in a small diner on the north side of Chicago, balancing double shifts and overdue bills, trying to make sure my life stayed one step ahead of falling apart. Someone like me? I repeated. My voice stayed calm, but I could feel the eyes of nearby customers subtly shifting in our direction. He nodded slightly, as if confirming that I had heard him correctly. I exhaled slowly and set the notepad down on the edge of the table. I could have taken offense. I could have walked away. That would have been easier. Instead, I met his gaze directly. If you are asking whether I am qualified to handle something important, you already made a mistake, I said. He did not react. Not visibly. And what mistake is that? He asked. I tilted my head slightly. You are assuming importance is something people are given instead of something they prove every day. The words were not rehearsed. They simply came out. Around us, the diner noise continued, but it felt further away now, like the room had shifted its attention without fully realizing it. I continued. I show up to work when I am exhausted. I treat people with respect even when they do not return it. I do my job correctly even when no one is watching. So if your definition of important is based on titles or appearances, then no, I am probably not what you expect. I paused briefly, then added, but if your definition is based on consistency, responsibility, and honesty, then you are asking the wrong question. Silence followed. Not the uncomfortable kind, the attentive kind, the kind that makes you realize someone is actually listening instead of just waiting to respond. I expected him to dismiss it or challenge it. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, studying me with an expression that was no longer neutral. Something had shifted. Subtle, but real. Interesting, he said finally. Just that. One word. I picked up my notepad again, suddenly aware that my hands were steadier than my thoughts. Is there anything else I can get you? I asked, trying to return to normal rhythm. He did not answer immediately. His eyes moved briefly toward the two men at the corner table again, then back to me. Not yet, he said quietly. I nodded once and turned away, but I could feel it. Not his gaze exactly, but his attention. Like I had become something he did not expect to find in a place like this. And as I walked back toward the counter, I realized something I did not want to admit. I was no longer just serving him coffee. I was being observed, measured, and remembered. The word interesting stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was flattering and not because it was confusing, but because of the way he said it. Like I had not simply answered a question, but disrupted a pattern he had been using his entire life. The diner returned to normal after that. Orders kept coming in. Coffee kept flowing. The lunch rush slowly replaced the quiet morning atmosphere. But I could feel it. Every time I passed table 7, there was a shift I could not ignore. He was still there. Still watching. Not in an obvious way. Not in a way that would make someone uncomfortable if they were not paying attention. But I was paying attention now. And that made all the difference. Around noon, I stopped by his table again to refill his coffee. You are still here, I said casually, trying to sound normal. He looked up from his cup. Is that unusual? For most people, yes. And for me, I hesitated for a moment. For you, it is becoming a pattern. That made him pause slightly. Not dramatically. Just enough to show he understood the implication. He leaned back in his seat, eyes briefly scanning the room before returning to me. People here know you, he said. It was not a question. Some of them, I replied. You have worked here long? Long enough to know most people order the same thing every time and still act surprised when it arrives correctly. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. That sounds exhausting. It is not glamorous, I admitted. But it is honest work. He nodded slowly, as if storing that information somewhere important. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple black phone, checking it briefly before placing it back down. No urgency. No visible stress. But I noticed the two men at the corner booth shift again, their attention tightening slightly. I followed their gaze for a second before looking back at him. You have people watching you, I said quietly. Yes. That does not bother you? It depends on who is watching, he replied. The answer was calm. Too calm. Like surveillance, attention, or pressure was simply part of his environment. I shook my head slightly. That is not a normal answer. Normal is relative, he said. So is trust. The word brought the conversation back to where it started earlier that morning. I crossed my arms lightly. You are still thinking about my answer. I am always thinking, he said. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one I have. That made me stop for a second. Not because it was profound, but because it was consistent. He did not speak like someone trying to impress me. He spoke like someone testing reality itself through conversation. A few minutes later, a customer at another table called for me. I excused myself and handled the order, but when I returned, something had changed again. The energy at table 7 was heavier. The two men in the corner were no longer casually observing. They were focused, direct, and for the first time I noticed that Victor Romano was no longer simply sitting. He was listening. Differently. Watching differently. Like something had shifted outside the diner that only he could feel. When I approached with his refill, I lowered my voice slightly. Everything okay? He did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the window where a black car had slowly pulled up outside. Then he finally spoke. That depends on perspective. I followed his gaze but said nothing. The car remained parked. Engine running. No one got out. Yet something about the moment felt like the calm before a decision had already been made somewhere else. I set the coffee down carefully. Do you need anything? I asked. For the first time that day, he looked directly at me without calculation. Not from here, he said quietly. And somehow that answer made the entire room feel smaller than it had ever felt before. The moment he said those words, the diner felt different again. Not louder. Not quieter. Just shifted. Like a room reacting to something unseen passing through it. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, my hand still resting on the edge of his table, the coffee pot tilted slightly as if I had forgotten what I was doing. Not from fear. Not from confusion. From awareness. Something about the way he said, "Not from here," stayed in my mind longer than I wanted it to. I straightened the pot and forced myself to move. All right, I said softly. Let me know if you need anything else. He gave a small nod, but his attention had already returned to the window. I walked away, yet I could feel it again. That invisible pressure. Not directed at me, but surrounding him. The kind of presence that made everything else in the room feel slightly less important. When I reached the counter, Jenna leaned in immediately. That man is not normal, she whispered. Most customers are not, I replied, trying to sound casual while pouring water into a glass I did not need. No, she insisted, glancing toward table 7. I mean, really not normal. Look at those two guys behind him. I did. The men in the corner booth had not moved for a long time. Their posture was controlled, their attention fixed, not on their food, not on the diner, but on him. It was subtle but unmistakable. Maybe they are business partners, I said, though even I did not believe it. Jenna frowned. Business partners do not stare at someone like that. I had no answer for that. By mid-afternoon, the black car outside was still there. Engine off now. No movement. Just presence. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on clearing tables and refilling drinks, but something in me kept pulling back toward table 7. Victor Romano had not moved much either. He had finished his coffee and ordered nothing else, yet he remained seated as if waiting for something that had not arrived yet. When I brought him a refill anyway, more out of habit than necessity, I placed it quietly in front of him. You are still here, I said before I could stop myself. He looked up at me. So are you. I blinked. I work here. Most people who work somewhere still leave when their shift ends, he replied. I could not argue with that. I adjusted my apron slightly. Do you usually stay in one place this long? A pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. Only when I am evaluating something. The answer made my stomach tighten slightly. "And what exactly are you evaluating here?" I asked. For a moment I thought he might avoid the question. Instead he looked around the diner slowly. The worn booths, the flickering neon sign, the steady rhythm of ordinary life continuing around us. Then his eyes returned to me. "Patterns," he said simply. That was all. No explanation. No elaboration. Just one word that felt heavier than it should have. Before I could respond, one of the men from the corner booth stood up. He did not approach the counter. He simply walked past Victor's table, paused for half a second, and spoke quietly enough that only they could hear. I caught only fragments. Something about timing. Something about confirmation. Victor did not react immediately. He only nodded once. The man left the diner without looking back. The door closed behind him with a soft chime that felt louder than it should have. I stared at Victor, trying to read his expression. It had not changed, but something inside it had tightened. "Everything okay?" I asked again. He did not answer right away. Instead, he placed a few bills on the table, far more than the cost of his coffee. Then he stood. Slowly. Calmly. "Olivia Bennett," he said. I froze for a second time that day. Hearing my name from him still felt unfamiliar. "Yes." He looked at me directly. "No distraction. No observation. Just focus. If someone asks you questions tomorrow," he said quietly, "do not answer them." A pause. My heart rate shifted without permission. "What kind of questions?" I asked. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he said, "The kind that sound polite." And just like that he walked toward the exit. No rush. No urgency. The bell above the door chimed as he left, and the black car outside finally started moving. I stood there behind the counter, the coffee pot still in my hand, realizing something I did not want to admit yet. Whatever had started with one simple question was no longer happening inside my diner. It was happening around it. The diner felt quieter after he left, but not in a comforting way. It was the kind of quiet that made every normal sound feel louder than it should have been. The hum of the refrigerator, the clink of plates in the kitchen, the faint hiss of the coffee machine. Everything suddenly felt like it had edges. I stayed behind the counter longer than necessary, pretending to reorganize sugar packets and stirrers, even though everything was already in place. My mind kept replaying his words. "If someone asks you questions tomorrow, do not answer them. The kind that sound polite." I had heard strange things before in life, but never something that felt like a warning delivered without emotion. Jenna walked over slowly, glancing toward the empty booth. "He is gone?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And I think I am supposed to pretend that means nothing." She frowned. "That is not normal." "I am starting to notice a pattern," I replied quietly. The rest of the afternoon passed with forced routine. Customers came and went. Orders were taken. Coffee was refilled. Yet everything felt slightly disconnected, like I was watching my own life from a small distance. Every time the diner bell rang, I instinctively looked up, half expecting him to return. But he did not. By the time my shift ended, the sky outside had shifted into deep orange and gray, the kind of sunset that made Chicago look both beautiful and uneasy at the same time. I stepped outside, pulling my coat tighter, and immediately noticed something that made me stop walking. A black car was parked across the street. Not moving. Not subtle. Just there. The same type I had seen before. My stomach tightened slightly. I told myself it was coincidence. There were thousands of black cars in Chicago. I started walking toward the bus stop anyway, keeping my eyes forward, but I could feel it. The sense of being observed without seeing anyone directly. When I finally reached my apartment building, I checked behind me once. The street was normal. Traffic. People. Noise. Nothing unusual. Inside, my apartment felt smaller than usual. I locked the door, set my bag down, and tried to focus on normal things. Dinner. Laundry. The message I had to send to my mother about her appointment tomorrow. Routine was supposed to make things feel stable. It did not work that night. My phone rang just after 9. Unknown number again. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello." A pause. Then a calm voice. Not familiar. Not emotional. "Miss Bennett, we need to ask you a few questions regarding someone you spoke with today." My body went still. I did not ask who we was. I already knew I would not get a simple answer. I am sorry, I said carefully, but I do not know what you are talking about. A slight pause on the other end. You had a customer earlier today. A man named Victor Romano. My grip tightened on the phone. I looked toward my window instinctively, even though nothing was there. He was just a customer, I said again, repeating my earlier words, but this time they felt less certain. We only need a few answers, the voice continued. It will be simple. I swallowed slowly. Something about the tone made it clear that simple was not the right word. I glanced around my apartment as if it could offer advice. I think you have the wrong person, I said finally. I serve coffee. That is all. A long pause followed. Then the voice spoke again, softer this time. That is exactly why we are calling you. The line disconnected. I stood there holding the phone, not moving, listening to the silence that followed. The city outside continued normally, unaware of anything unusual happening inside my life. But I was no longer part of that normal rhythm. Not really. Because now I understood something I had not wanted to admit earlier. Victor Romano was not just a customer who asked strange questions. And I was no longer just a waitress who answered them. The night after the phone call did not feel like rest. Felt like waiting. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city outside my apartment window. Sirens far away. A passing train. The occasional hum of traffic that never truly stopped in Chicago. But none of it helped my mind slow down. The words from the phone call kept repeating themselves. That is exactly why we are calling you. I had spent years working in places where I was invisible to most people. That was familiar. Safe even. But now it felt like something had shifted, like invisibility was no longer an option I had. The next morning I went to work earlier than usual. The diner was still quiet when I arrived. Chairs were upside down on tables. The floor had just been mopped, leaving a faint smell of cleaning solution in the air. Jenna was already there, wiping down the counter. You look like you did not sleep, she said immediately.
I slept, I replied.
Just not well. She studied me for a second. Is this about that man again? I hesitated. It is about the fact that people I do not know are now calling me about him. Jenna stopped wiping the counter. That sounds worse than about him. I did not argue, as she was right. By mid-morning the diner started to fill. Regular customers returned. The rhythm of coffee orders and breakfast plates resumed. But I could feel something different in myself. I kept glancing at the door more often than usual. Every time the bell rang, my body reacted before my mind did. Expectation, then disappointment, then relief when it was someone else. Around 11 o'clock it finally happened. The bell rang again. I looked up and this time I did not feel surprise. Only confirmation. Victor Romano walked in as if nothing had changed. Same posture. Same calm presence. Same controlled silence that seemed to enter the room before he did. He did not look around immediately. He simply stepped inside, paused for a moment, and then chose the same table as before. I stood frozen for half a second longer than I should have. Then I picked up a coffee pot and walked toward him. You should not be here, I said quietly as I approached. That is an unusual greeting, he replied. I placed the coffee down in front of him. I got a phone call last night. That finally made him look at me more directly. Not surprised. Not confused. But attentive in a way that felt heavier than either of those reactions. From who? He asked. They did not say a name, I replied. But they asked about you. A slight pause. He leaned back slightly in his seat, eyes shifting toward the window for a brief moment. Outside the street looked normal. People walking. Cars passing. A world that continued without awareness of anything unusual happening inside this small diner. And what did you tell them? He asked. I met his gaze. That you were just a customer. A small silence followed. Not tense. Not relaxed. Just measured. Like both of us were aware that something important had just been confirmed without being spoken aloud. That was the correct answer, he said finally. I let out a short breath. That does not make me feel better. It was not meant to, he replied. I crossed my arms slightly. Then why are you here? For the first time since I met him, his expression shifted slightly. Not emotionally. Strategically. Like he was choosing words carefully before speaking them. Because leaving would not change anything, he said. I frowned. Change what? He looked at me directly now.
No distraction. No hesitation.
The fact that you are already involved. The words landed quietly, but they changed the air between us completely. I glanced around the diner instinctively. Customers talking. Plates moving. Coffee being poured. Everything looked normal. But nothing felt normal anymore. I am not involved in anything, I said immediately. He did not argue. Instead he simply said, not yet. And somehow that was worse than a disagreement, because it sounded like a timeline, not an opinion. I set the coffee pot down carefully, my hand steadier than I felt. Then tell me what is going on, I said quietly. He held my gaze for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice lower than before. That is exactly why I asked you the first question. The silence after his last sentence did not feel empty. It felt full. Full of meaning I did not fully understand yet, and full of implications I was not sure I wanted to understand at all. I stood behind the counter for a moment longer than necessary, watching him sit at table 7 as if nothing in the world had shifted. But everything had shifted. The first question, I repeated quietly under my breath, almost to myself. Jenna looked over at me while restocking napkins. What? She asked. Nothing, I said quickly. But my mind was already running ahead of me. The diner felt different that day. Not because anything had changed physically, but because I had changed how I looked at it. Every customer felt more distant, like I was no longer fully inside the normal rhythm of the place. I kept waiting for something I could not define. When I brought Victor his coffee again later that morning, I placed it carefully on the table but did not leave immediately. You said I was already involved, I said. He looked up from the window. Yes. In what exactly? A pause. Not hesitation. Calculation. A situation you have not been introduced to yet, he said. I narrowed my eyes slightly. That is not an answer. It is the only one you need for now. I let out a small breath of frustration. That is not how normal conversations work. For the first time that day, a faint hint of something like amusement crossed his face. Most of my conversations are not normal, he replied. I should have walked away. I knew that. But instead I stayed. So what was the question you asked me earlier supposed to do? I asked. He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands near the coffee cup again. It was supposed to measure something, he said. Measure what? Whether you react with emotion or with reasoning when you are placed under pressure. I blinked slowly. You tested me. It was not a question. He did not deny it. Yes. The word landed cleanly without apology. I felt something tighten in my chest, not anger exactly, but something closer to disbelief. I am not a subject in an experiment, I said. No, he agreed calmly. You are not. That answer surprised me more than the test itself. I folded my arms. Then why does it feel like I am being evaluated? He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Because you are. The simplicity of it made it worse. Around us, the diner continued its normal life. A customer laughed near the window. Someone dropped a fork. A coffee pot hissed softly in the background. But at table 7, everything felt separated from that reality. And what did I pass or fail? I asked quietly. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his coffee, then back at me. You did not fail, he said finally. That is not reassuring. It is not meant to be reassurance. I shook my head slightly. You realize this is insane, right? A small pause. From your perspective, yes. I stared at him for a moment longer than I intended. There was no arrogance in his tone. No attempt to convince me otherwise. Just certainty. The kind of certainty that did not need approval from anyone else. I exhaled slowly. You are making my life very complicated, I said. It was already complicated, he replied. That stopped me for a second, because he was right even if I did not want him to be. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated softly on the table. He glanced at it once, then stood up. I have to leave, he said. I nodded slightly, still processing everything. He reached the exit, then paused briefly without turning around. Olivia, he said. I looked up. If someone asks you questions again, he repeated, do not answer them. This time I did not argue. I only asked one thing. Why me? A quiet pause followed. Then he answered without looking back. Because you are the first person who answered differently. And then he left, the bell above the door ringing softly behind him, leaving me alone with a question that felt like it had already begun to change everything around me. The rest of the day felt like it had been separated from me, as if I was still physically present in the diner but mentally standing somewhere slightly above it, watching everything happen from a distance. I served customers, refilled coffee, cleared tables, and smiled when I was supposed to smile, but every action felt slightly delayed, like my thoughts were arriving half a second too late. The question Victor left behind was still repeating itself in my mind. Because you are the first person who answered differently. It did not feel like a compliment. It felt like a measurement that had not yet finished being calculated. By late afternoon, the diner had slowed again. The lunch rush faded into quiet booths and scattered conversations. Jenna leaned against the counter, watching me closely for a while before speaking. You have been off all day, she said. I am fine, I replied automatically. She raised an eyebrow. That is your second lie today. I exhaled slowly, setting down a stack of clean cups. I do not know what is happening, I admitted. Then maybe stop trying to figure it out alone, she said. I did not respond because I did not have a better answer. Around 6 in the evening, the sky outside darkened early, heavy clouds rolling in over Chicago again. The kind of weather that made everything feel slightly heavier than it should be. I was finishing an order at table 4 when I noticed something unusual. The corner booth where Victor usually sat was occupied again. But not by him. By someone else. A man I did not recognize. He was dressed neatly, too neatly for a casual diner, and he was not looking at the menu. He was looking at me. I felt my steps slow slightly as I approached. Can I help you? I asked carefully. He smiled politely. You are Olivia Bennett. It was not a question. I felt my stomach tighten immediately. Yes, I said cautiously. Who are you? He leaned back slightly, as if considering how to answer. Someone who is trying to understand a situation that may have been misread. I placed the order pad on the table but did not sit anything down. I do not understand what that means. His smile faded slightly. It means you have been interacting with Victor Romano. My heartbeat changed pace instantly. I kept my voice steady. He is a customer. The man nodded slowly. That is what we expected you to say. Something in his tone made the air feel colder. I crossed my arms slightly. If you are here to ask questions, I already answered some yesterday. Not to us, he said. I frowned. Then who exactly are you? A pause. He reached into his coat but did not pull anything out yet. Just the movement was enough to make me tense. People who monitor outcomes, he said finally. Outcomes of what? I asked. He looked at me directly now. Of influence. The word did not make sense in the context of my life. I worked in a diner. I refilled coffee cups. I calculated tips at the end of the night to make sure I could pay rent on time. There was nothing about that word that belonged near me. Before I could respond, the diner bell rang again. I turned instinctively, and for the second time that day, I felt that strange shift in the room.
Victor Romano walked in.
He stopped the moment he saw the man sitting in the corner booth.
No surprise.
No greeting. Just recognition. The atmosphere changed immediately. Not loudly but completely. Like a thread tightening beneath the surface of everything. I watched as Victor slowly walked toward the table. His movements calm but deliberate. When he reached it, he did not sit. He simply looked down at the man. You are early, Victor said quietly. The man smiled slightly. You are predictable. I stood frozen behind the counter, suddenly aware that I was no longer part of a simple diner shift. I was standing in the middle of something that had existed long before I ever noticed it. Victor finally turned his head slightly toward me, just enough for me to see his expression. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was something far more controlled. Olivia, he said calmly, finish your shift and go home early tonight. I hesitated. Why? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked back at the man across the table. Because tonight, he said quietly, some questions are no longer optional. The moment Victor finished speaking, the diner no longer felt like a diner. It felt like a boundary had been crossed, one that I could not see but could clearly sense in the air. The words "some questions are no longer optional" stayed suspended between the tables, heavy and unresolved. I stood behind the counter, unable to move for a second longer than I should have. Jenna whispered my name, but it sounded distant, like it belonged to another version of me. At table 7, Victor remained standing. The man across from him finally leaned forward slightly, still calm, still composed, but the tension between them had shifted into something more precise. Not loud, not dramatic, just controlled pressure. You are involving her more than expected, the man said. Victor did not deny it. She is already involved, he replied. I felt my chest tighten. They were talking about me like I was not standing 10 meters away. Like I was already part of a system I had never agreed to enter. I finally stepped forward slightly, my voice careful. I do not understand what is happening here. Both men paused briefly. The man in the booth looked at me first. His expression was measured, almost polite. You do not need to understand everything, he said. Only what concerns you directly. Victor's voice cut in immediately, calm but firm. She does not concern you. The man smiled faintly. That is not your decision. The silence that followed felt different from all the silences I had experienced before. This one had direction, meaning. I looked at Victor. You told me to go home early, I said quietly. He nodded once. That is still the correct choice. Then what about you? I asked before I could stop myself. For a fraction of a second, something shifted in his expression. Not uncertainty, not fear. Something closer to restraint. I will handle this, he said. The man in the booth leaned back slightly. You always say that, he replied. I took a slow breath, trying to understand why my life suddenly felt like it was split into before and after without my permission. If this is about me, I said, then I deserve to know what is happening. The man turned his gaze toward me fully now. You are correct, he said. You do deserve to know. Victor's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. The man continued. You have been observed because your interaction with Victor Romano has produced an unexpected variable. I frowned. I am not a variable. That is not how we define it, he said calmly. I looked at Victor again. Do you agree with this? I asked. A long pause followed. The diner behind us continued its quiet rhythm, unaware that something irreversible was unfolding in one of its corners. Finally, Victor spoke. No, he said simply. That single word changed the air again. The man in the booth studied him carefully. Then you are already deviating from the original structure. Victor took a step forward, just slightly, enough to signal control without aggression. There was never a structure that included her, he said. That was your assumption, not mine. I felt my hands curl slightly at my sides. None of this made sense in the way my life usually made sense. There were no clear rules. No familiar logic. Only layers of conversation that kept moving further away from anything normal. I exhaled slowly. I am going home, I said finally. Both men turned to look at me. Victor nodded immediately. Good. The man in the booth did not stop me. He simply watched as I removed my apron and stepped away from the counter. Before I reached the door, I hesitated and looked back one last time. Victor met my eyes briefly. Not as a boss. Not as a stranger. But as someone making a decision without fully explaining it. Olivia, he said quietly. I stopped. Do not answer unknown calls tonight, he repeated. The same warning from before. But this time it did not feel like a suggestion. Felt like a line being drawn. I nodded once, then walked out into the night air, leaving behind a diner that no longer felt like it belonged only to my world.